right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and I'm very excited to have back Dr. Bruce Perry. Dr. Perry, welcome.
Thanks very much.
All right. So Dr. Bruce Perry is a child and adolescent psychiatrist and neuroscientist. He's senior fellow at the ChildTrauma Academy and an adjunct professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Northwestern's Feinberg School of Medicine. In addition to having written more than 200 scientific articles, Dr. Perry has co-authored with Maia Szalavitz 2 books for general audiences, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, as well as Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. I want to talk about The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. That's easily one of my favorite books. But before I want to get to something, I want to talk about this briefly, if we can, the Oprah thing. Because I think that, from my understanding, you got a lot of press from that. I was online and Twitter and so forth. Yeah. How did that come about? What was your goal with that opportunity? Because when I saw that you had done that, I said to myself, it's about time that this is getting out. So if you could say a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, most people probably don't know this, but I've actually known Oprah for like 30 years.
Wow.
And back when we were both in Chicago, we first met, and, I got to know her really in context of the issue of trauma. She came, I think it was about 30 years ago, when she decided to go public with her own abuse experience, and wanted to kind of address this problem, and reached out to a few people to say, basically, how do we solve this problem in our culture? And honestly, it's a long story about how she picked some young punk at the University of Chicago to be part of that process. But I ended up kind of having this opportunity to meet her and talk about the work we were doing. And from that point forward, we've had a number of ongoing conversations about this and about the impact of abuse on a variety of cultural issues. We've talked about racism in our culture. We talked a lot about community violence, because at that time, I know that many people are aware of the real problem with violence in Chicago now, but it was worse 25 years ago. And so we talked a lot about those kinds of things. And over the years, we've had the opportunity to meet on multiple occasions and talk about this stuff. And it's interesting that one of the things that happened after her show was finished, and again, I'm just speculating, but it's hard for us to imagine how busy this woman was. Mm-hmm. And I think that, as most of you all know, if you study trauma, you learn a little bit about how stress influences cognition, right? Yeah. So when you're all busy and overscheduled and you got a million things to do, it's really hard to sit back and reflect on things that you actually have been exposed to and kind of connect the dots and be really reflective. And so I think that even though I was talking with her about these things, she would go from one of our conversations, bam, to just another show, and then another show. And then Paul McCartney wants to talk, and then Michael Jackson wants to talk. And, it's her ability to reflect on this and let it sink in, I think, took time. And then when her show ended, she had more opportunities for thinking. And that's, I think, when the aha moments came for her. And as she connected those dots, she was working for 60 Minutes. There was a story in the Milwaukee paper about trauma in that community. And since she grew up there, she said, hey, she told the 60 Minutes producers, talk to Bruce Perry about this. He'll give you some good background stuff. And she wasn't aware of the fact that the program that they were featuring in Milwaukee had actually trained with us. Oh. So when she heard that, she's like, well, let's have Bruce on the show. And so that's kind of how that happened.
Wow. Okay. Interesting that this had kind of started many, many years ago.
30 years ago.
Wow. That's incredible. I just thought, the platform obviously this woman has to get this word out. Yeah. Is incredible.
Well, and the good news about this is that she is continuing to act on this issue. And I can't talk about it completely now, but there are going to be a number of things in the near future where she jumps back into the public engagement process about the importance of trauma. And I believe, as the 60 Minutes piece did, which was very brief,
right.
her next steps in this arena are going to be much more sustained, and they're going to be a deeper dive, and I think there'll be more impact. So,
Awesome. All right, I appreciate you sharing, taking the time to share that. All right, so as we kind of talked about before we started recording, my goal in having you back here was to talk a little bit more specifically about the neurosequential model, what that looks like, and what that means for people kind of on the ground in a sense. So why don't you take it away there?
Sure. So, it's the neurosequential model is really, again, in its current iteration, is an approach to clinical problem solving with children and families that have been impacted by trauma, neglect, chaos, threat, and so forth. And it's the evolution of many, many years of recognizing that the conventional, come to my office, I'm going to pull out the DSM and spend 1 hour a week with you and somehow make all this stuff get better. That wasn't working for me. And it wasn't working for the kids and families I was trying to help. So having been trained as a neuroscientist and having studied the development of the stress response systems in the brain, I knew a couple things that should have informed my clinical work with individuals who'd been impacted by trauma, but I hadn't really, I was too young as a clinician to feel comfortable kind of breaking out of the mold. But over time, as I realized that, that child mental health and traumatology are both really young fields, and I felt more comfortable with kind of experimenting with what I thought might be plausible approaches or plausible elements of intervention that might be helpful. And so really what evolved was that this neurosequential model. And the first part of it is that I've always believed that if you understand a little bit about how the brain works and how the brain changes, that you'll be more effective at therapeutics and more effective as a parent. You'll be more effective as a coach. I mean, anything you do to try and change the brain, if you understand kind of some of the rules about how the brain works, you're more likely to be useful or effective. And I recognize there are a couple of things that were really important. First of all is that a neuroscience-based perspective isn't the only way to understand human behavior. And in fact, if you rely upon it as the only way to understand behavior, you're going to miss out on a lot of stuff and you're going to make a lot of mistakes. But I recognize that it was a helpful perspective, and it should be, and it could be, I hoped, integrated into people's understanding about how people work. And so I kind of approached it with a sense of respect that, listen, this isn't going to solve every problem, but this is going to be a useful complement to an analytic perspective or an object relations perspective or a traditional developmental psychology perspective, because theoretically we're kind of blind men at the elephant, kind of, and if we get more of the blind men talking to each other about what they're seeing, you're going to get a better reconstruction of what's happening. And so that's the first part of it, is that we kind of took this respectful stance. And then the second part is like, what are some of the core principles that we know about how the brain processes information and changes? And that really probably the one that permeates this model more and more and more, as certainly it's reinforced the more we do this work, is that the brain actually both develops from the bottom up, and as you know, from intrauterine all the way up to age 25, by the time your cortex gets fully organized. but it also processes sensory input from the bottom up. And one of the things that we knew is that the lower parts of the brain are simpler and more regulatory, and they actually are more categorical in their problem solving. So incoming information to the lowest part of the brain is perceived, it's processed and then acted on if needed, but then it goes to the middle level of the brain and there's a processing, and then the top part of the brain, which is really, the top part of the brain is where, it's where we're speech and language and future planning and executive functioning and all that stuff that we kind of find special about human beings. But the problem is, in order to get to that really smart part of your brain, the part of the brain that tells time, you have to go through more primitive, reactive parts of the brain. And so if the incoming signal is of sufficient intensity, these lower parts of the brain are going to act before you actually have a chance to process accurately what's happening. And this is a hallmark of a lot of trauma-related behaviors, is that the present experiences that are coming into the lower part of the brain, being processed by these systems in the lower part of the brain and passed on to the higher parts of the brain, these parts of the brain can be influenced by associations from the past. So if you made the association between attributes of men and threat, you have a male math teacher, he may raise his voice a little bit in frustration, and the lower part of your brain, which can't tell time, the top part of your brain can tell time, the lower part of your brain can't. If that signal comes in, the lower part of your brain may tell you basically that you are under threat in the same way that your abuser threatened you. But in reality, you're not under threat. In reality, it's the math teacher who's frustrated. Not with you even. He's frustrated with that kid over there, but he raised his voice. And all of a sudden, you have a threat-related behavior that derails your experience in math class. And so this is kind of what we started to think about, that the brain develops in a sequential way, the brain processes information in a sequential way, and we realized, maybe we should think about healing and doing therapeutics in a sequential way that sort of work with the lower parts of the brain and then the middle parts and then the top parts. And that's kind of where the neurosequential model evolved, is from that conceptualization.
So just to make clear, you distinguish that between or from an intervention per se. This is an approach that is more of an overlay or a construct with which to use different interventions?
Exactly. And the neurosequential model itself and the metrics that we develop to help us in this process, they're not interventions. They're basically tools to help you understand the child and their family and their world, and help you as a clinician or a clinical team decide where to start your therapeutic work. Is this child so dysregulated that we really can't do insight-oriented work? Are they able to manage relationships, or do they have relational sensitivities so much to the point where let's focus on regulatory stuff? Let's be present in parallel and just kind of walk. Or I'll color in parallel with this kid before I try to dyadically engage them. And I'll give the child control over the process of the dyadic engagement. Because when you give kids control, they feel safer. Mm-hmm. And for many kids, some of the most overwhelming evocative cues that are threat related are interpersonal. And so relational cues, physical proximity, touch, have been associated with threat. And so some of our therapeutic approaches that rely upon connectivity can sometimes be inadvertently evocative cues. Mm-hmm. And in our efforts to sort of engage a child, we may drive them away or escalate them. And so again, a big part of what we've been trying to do is create this construct where we get kind of a playbook for how the child's organized, and then use that to decide how to select and sequence our therapeutic approach.
Okay. So what would this kind of look like if we kind of drill down in terms of maybe a case example or two? How might a clinician utilize this? And again, someone who's maybe well-versed in somatic experiencing or sensory motor psychotherapy or anything,
right,
could utilize this.
Yeah. Let me, I'm going to, if you'll indulge me for a second, I'm going to pull up a couple of slides and kind of talk about how this works. Is that
awesome.
right?
Awesome. Yeah, of course.
So let me do this first, and then let me exit this share.
Are you in Houston, by the way?
I'm actually in Chattanooga, Tennessee right now.
Oh, okay. Oh, nice.
So you should be seeing my,
yep.
All right. So let me start with this. So this is one of the basic heuristics that we use all the time. And this heuristic is kind of the upside down triangle brain. This is the top part of the brain. I was talking about the cortex. This is the bottom part. If you look at how the brain sort of is hierarchically organized, you see that some of these regulatory functions are mediated by lower parts of the brain. And as you get higher in the brain, you get sort of the more sort of unique, complex human functions that I was talking about. And they're all tied together to some degree by these core regulatory networks in our brain. We have, one of the big challenges of the human brain, actually of any brain, is how do you get billions of separate neurons and neural networks to kind of work together? And one of the micro-architectural strategies is to use widely distributed networks that actually have cells that go from lower parts of the brain up through to multiple other parts of the brain. So we have certain neural networks, noradrenergic, serotonergic, dopaminergic, that actually reach multiple parts of the brain and influence and get out to other parts of the body. And this makes them perfect candidates to be the backbone for a stress response. And I'll talk about that in a second, maybe some more. But this is another part of that hierarchical organization, that sequential processing that I talked about. That
okay.
If you look at the upside down triangle part of the brain thing here,
yep.
Here you got incoming information from the outside world, and you've got information coming into your brain from the inside world. So your brain has these sensory apparatus that help you monitor inside and outside. And the first place that all of this information goes isn't up to the cortex, right? You don't have a direct connection from visual input to the cortex. It goes to these lower parts of the brain. And then it's processed in these different systems, and ultimately it'll get up here. But if the incoming information is of sufficient intensity, the lower part of the brain can act on that information before it gets to the smart part of the brain. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you touch a hot stove accidentally, you'll withdraw your hand before you even know that it was the hot stove. Mm. And that's very protective. And so again, this is one of those adaptive organizational features that can become maladaptive in the situation of trauma. That if you act before you process, that gets you into trouble. So what we do with the neurosequential model, one of the things that we do is that we have a heuristic that we create. It's a measure where we reconstruct how an individual's central nervous system is organized. And so we'll ask questions, and we have a semi-structured process to teach people how to do this. And we'll look at a bunch of different functions, and we'll use how well the individual's doing in those functional domains to create kind of a reconstruction of how their brain's organized. And, here's an example of how this looks. Here's just a tiny little word about how to explain the scoring. So if in a functional area, let's say down here in regulation of heart rate, for example, this 10-year-old individual right here has a normal cardiovascular regulation, and that happens to be for a neurotypical 10-year-old, that's pretty similar to adult-like functioning. We give them a high score and we color that dark green. If you look at an individual and a neurotypical 10-year-old, and you look at their cortex, one of the things that you see is, listen, they've got a pretty well organized, if you're a neurotypical 10-year-old, you're doing pretty well. You're talking, you're thinking, but in comparison to a fully organized adult cortex, it's not quite there. So yellow means that you are moderately organized and you're on your way towards fully organized like an adult. And so that's what these age typical comparisons are. And then if you take an actual client and you look at how this client is organized, what you see is this child has got all kinds of red boxes. And red basically means in those functions, this child is profoundly either dysregulated, disorganized, or undeveloped. And when you see a child like this, what you see is he's got certain significant problems with cortical functions, which a lot of the kids we work with have. They don't learn very well, and he's got speech and language problems. He's not got good executive functioning. But if you go down even lower, you see, wow, this kid also has relational problems, and he's got regulatory problems. He's got high resting heart rate, and he's got sleep issues. And so from the top to the bottom, he's got either undeveloped or poorly organized functioning. And so what a therapeutic approach would look like here, and let me just do this for 1 second. Go back to it just to get rid of all the mess. We would take the lowest part of the brain that appears to be significantly disorganized, and that would become our therapeutic front. And so Guy, think about this. Think about how many times we have a client who has a whole list of problems, right? He's got learning problems, got relational problems, got self-esteem problems, got fine motor control problems, and what we do is we tend to make a treatment plan for every one of those problems.
Right.
But the truth is, this child, before he's regulated, he's not going to be able to benefit from speech and language. If you send him off to a tutor, that's going to be a wasted hour. And so just put that aside. And let's focus on regulation. And what is going to help him with sensory integration? What's going to help him become regulated? Well, let's get an OT assessment. Let's get a sensory diet, and let's teach the family how to do some of these regulatory activities. And let's talk with the child about what he finds regulating. And let's look at the week, and let's put together kind of a schedule of regulating activities that over time have the plausibility of providing adequate repetitions to those networks to help them organize better. And then once they're better, like right here, now let's start talking about building in, let's move the therapeutic front from the lower part of the brain to the middle part of the brain. We'll keep up with some of the regulatory stuff, but now he's ready to focus on relational things. Let's do that. And then what would that look like? Let's make sure that he gets into some kind of adequate play therapy, and maybe certain kinds of opportunities for coached play with a peer, and give him relational repetitions where he can have some success. And then over time, once he gets to that, then you can start talking about insight-oriented stuff and cognitive things. And again, here's another example of a sequential process that started with a child that was profoundly like a feral child. And this was a highly somatosensory intervention until this point, and at this point it became more relational, and at this point they were able to add in more traditional sort of talk-oriented therapies. And so what happens is you can have a kid who goes through an NMT-guided treatment process, who will start with something like Pat Ogden somatosensory stuff, evolve into some form of, play therapy, and then ultimately get to a more trauma-focused CBT thing. And so you literally could have 3 different evidence-based practices, therapies that you use with the same child, but you use them when the child's ready to benefit from the key elements of that intervention.
Yeah, I mean, I love this. And one of the things as you're talking about, what I'm thinking is, when you listed all of those issues that maybe, or challenges the client might have, and you think to yourself, where you said, well, you start creating a treatment plan for each one of those things. If you're moving maybe too quickly or jumping up to the upper level stuff when the child's not ready, you're potentially setting them up for failure, which can, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is exactly right, Guy. And I think almost all of us as clinicians have had that experience where we get ahead of the client, right? And one of the things that now the thing that I want to just say is that you can have a sort of a neurodevelopmentally guided treatment approach without using these metrics. You don't have to use these metrics to kind of have that strategy in your clinical work. And in fact, we encourage people, if they feel that this sort of conceptual approach makes sense, to just give it a shot. What we've found is that these maps, the metric part of it, though, help us not make as many of those mistakes about sort of being out of sync with where the child is. And because the truth is we do have this interesting tendency to overestimate kind of developmentally where the kid is. And a lot of times we can get tricked, and everybody's probably had the experience of working with a child who's had one area where they're really sort of age appropriate and able to sort of be funny and joke with you and be articulate, but then they have this big gap in relational capabilities. So in the office with you, you're like, wow, they seem like they're able to engage me socially. But their ability to do that in a group of peers is completely absent, because that's a different function, And so it's not easy. It's not hard for us as clinicians to sometimes get tricked by, or make the mistake that a kid's functioning differently than, or we hope that they function, or make the mistake of judging that they'll function a certain way when they can't. But
this seems to me like not only really understanding the neurobiology and the neuroscience within the context of trauma, but really kind of utilizing it within the therapeutic context in interventions, right?
Right.
When you said when you were a younger clinician, you had the DSM out. What got you to this point? I mean, specifically, what were you running up against?
I was running up against the fact that these kids would, if you used the sort of the DSM framework and started your therapeutic approach, it was not at all uncommon for these kids with complex trauma to meet diagnostic criteria for 3 or 4 of the DSM diagnoses. And the odd thing was, you could be a great clinician and do really good work, but if you followed the rules, you were in this weird bind where you're like, geez, I got to give this kid 3 labels. And then 6 months later, you do a reevaluation and he's really got different labels. And it just, to me, it felt like I was trying to guide my treatment based upon a book as opposed to listening to the client and getting to know them as an individual. And ultimately, what this model does is we have no issue with people that want to use the DSM, but we don't think it has any validity. We think it's a reliable thing. We don't think it has any validity. I mean, in terms of the fact that it's not really describing things that are true. So what we've done is that rather than using a label, we use a picture. And so we don't say to a kid, you have this, you have ADHD. We go, hey, this is the way you are organized right now. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about it. And let's talk about what we can do. You actually, that fine motor control thing you have, that you can get better at that. There are exercises you can do so your handwriting is better. You want to do that or not? It's up to you. And we spend a tremendous amount of time in this model teaching the client, the parents, the teachers about sort of neuroplasticity and development and just kind of acknowledging, hey, listen, everybody's put together in a slightly different way. And every system in everybody's brain is going to be responsive to experience. So can you think with me about some kind of experience, things that you like to do that would lead to you being better regulated? And we'll talk with these kids and they'll say, yeah, when I get really upset, I like to go out and go running. Like, okay, that makes sense. But I don't think you can go for a 10-mile run every time you get pissed off in math. So is there something that's like running, that's regulatory, that takes advantage of that same need for sort of motor regulation that we can think about doing? And we'll work together to come up with a strategy to have tiny little sensory breaks. And we'll talk to the teacher about this and say, hey, listen, you got a choice. He's either going to blow up and leave your class, or you're going to let him take a walk. When he says, listen, I got to take a walk, you're going to say, fine, you got 3 minutes, be back in 3 minutes. At the same time, the kid has to agree with the teacher to let the teacher go up to him and say, listen, I got a feeling you need to take a walk. And so when you create this dyadic opportunity for the teacher to give the child a regulatory instruction, mm-hmm. and for the child to request a regulatory break, you end up decreasing restraints and critical incidents, and you're taking advantage of the somatosensory preference that kid has discovered in himself. He likes that large motor regulatory stuff, helps him regulate. And so that's a lot of what we do.
Are you finding communities, schools, or how receptive are schools and communities to this approach and this information?
It's variable, but in general, the places that are relatively open to this and try some of this stuff have had some really positive results, and then they become more enthusiastic. So what we'll find, for example, is that there'll be one teacher in a school who decides to introduce some kind of regulatory break. And then all of a sudden, their kids will do much, much, much better. And then the other teachers are like, what in the, how do you do that? I want some of that stuff. And so then there's a growth in that. And so, I could show you all kinds of data here about positive outcomes, but it's the bottom line is that in places that have been able to bring this approach in, we've seen a lot of positive results. We've seen decreases in restraints, decreases in critical incidents. We've seen increases in grades. We've seen fewer placement disruptions. We've seen, fewer teacher absences. We feel foster parents feel more competent and comfortable. In a lot of indicators about the shift in sort of the developmental climate, mm-hmm. it indicates that it's if people feel safer, they feel more connected, they feel more positive. And then, of course, when that happens, all kinds of good stuff happens. So,
right. So as we kind of get ready to close out here, just a couple more questions. So you've been doing this for a while. How have things changed in terms of the trauma, awareness of trauma?
Yeah, I was just talking with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris about this very thing, that 30 years ago when I first talked to Oprah about some of this stuff, that there was really maybe honestly a handful of people in the United States that were explicitly talking about childhood trauma. And in the last 10 years, there's really been what I would perceive to be an explosion in awareness of these issues. And it's an interesting thing, and I'm sure many of the people who are listening, who have been in this field for many, many years, are kind of seeing the same thing. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because on one hand, it's a very positive change. People are more aware of it. But on the other hand, one of the things I see that we're going to have to just continue to try to correct is that there's a lot of oversimplified sort of information out there about adversity, ACEs, how to solve the problem. The ACE surveillance, for example, that if everybody gets an ACE test, then we'll kind of have addressed the issue. And, mm-hmm. All of us as clinicians know it's a little bit more complex than just sort of getting a score on an ACE inventory. And I think that's the dilemma that we have, the hardest thing about good clinical work is that it's hard work. It takes time, it takes relationships, it takes investment and engagement that our current medical economic model doesn't want to support. Mm-hmm. All of our big systems are kind of looking for quick fix approaches that just, there aren't quick fixes to a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Right. And, but I do think that sort of we're going to have to take the bad with the good. But overall, I think that there's a lot of positive progress around public engagement and awareness around this.
For the newer clinicians kind of just starting out saying, I'm love to kind of learn more about trauma, even become a trauma therapist, kind of specialize in this, what advice or suggestions would you give to them?
I think the biggest piece of advice is to be patient with yourself. And be patient with your own progress, and really respect your clients and their life story. Listen to them. They're going to teach you so much. And I know that almost all clinicians work within the systemic restraints that I don't have because of the nature of our work. Our work is well-funded, and we are able to kind of do what we want. I know most clinicians have constraints to the way they practice, but within those constraints, if you listen to your client and you're present with them, you will grow and you will help them. And as the field gets better, the constraints that are limiting both the time and the way that do your work, they're going to start to go away. Because I think ultimately people will see the cost, the economic wisdom of doing this the right way. Because if we don't do clinical work the right way, these folks just end up being part of a transgenerational challenge, and they consume resources from all these other systems. But if good clinicians are given the opportunity to do work with their clients, it's a tremendous benefit to our culture. Mm-hmm. It doesn't just help individuals, which is a really good thing, but then the transgenerational magnification of that positive thing and the way that healthier person is going to create an echo of health in their life, it's just really powerful. Yeah. And so I guess the piece of advice would be to be patient, do really good work where and when you can, and don't underestimate how powerful the moment is in your work with the client.
Awesome. All right, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. You exude hope. You really do. And I love that. I appreciate that.
Thank you,
Harry.
Thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.